I'm going to be trying to compare four different concepts in the philosophy of science: justification, legitimation, legitimization, verification, and falsification. These concepts have been used, widely in by various different philosophers in almost any book, and especially for the three first terms, they also are used widely in general discourse. The first, I suppose, distinction that we can make is first the root of the word. Of course, the second two words seem to have something to do with each other, and we know that the first two words are also in a kind of relationship of maybe a synonymity, but not necessarily. For example, justification is extendable to legitimization, but not the other way around. We can't use the word legitimization for every use of the word justification that we can come up with. Similarly, verification can also be used to mean falsification in a particular context, which I'll get to. But, of course, those two words have as a prefix the very opposite terms. One is veri and the other falsi, which come from the Latin true and false. The truth, verity, vérité, also in French. Justification relates usually to things that are, and that we think are objectively real, and that we use in order to come to some conclusions. So the justification process, for example, formal justification or logical justification, are ways to derivate from certain premises to a conclusion that is supposed to be valid. So valid is a different term that is almost synonym to justification, and it would be justified to do that. But also, there's also a moral sense that it can be used. That's what I meant by it's extendable to legitimization, because legitimization is usually exclusively exclusively used for things that we ought to do. In ethical terms, we try to legitimize an action or a whole state of being, a state of affairs, a status quo. In any case, both of these terms can be used rationally. Let's compare the word reasonable. They can be reasoned with, that we're able to reason with them. And justification is perhaps even more so, because legitimization in certain forms are not reasonable, but they are official, they are static, maybe they are steadfast in a certain way that we cannot budge. If we refer to ethical ways of talking about the term justification in particular, for example, I can justify every one of my actions, and that would be assumed to be very reasonable and very rational even. However, I can also justify any single one of my actions, for instance in hindsight, and that would seem to be kind of pathological. Perhaps it would be I would try to justify even bad things, to legitimize bad things. So if we introduce this value judgment, of course, it is a justification, not in that it makes it valid, but perhaps an invalid justification, an ad hoc justification. If we justify something or even legitimize something, we sometimes have a primary interest, a primary question in mind, for which some means to that end can be justified. In German we have this term Staatsräson, and it is used to describe in political realism, for example, the philosophy of Machiavelli or the philosophy of the Shangyan. In that the legalist school, the so-called legalists, in China, for example, their whole program is a Staatsräson. It's a legitimization of the state, and it is trying to legitimize, justify an end, the political end, by using certain means, certain tools, certain actions. And one of those is to have an emperor in charge. One of those is also to use the law as a means to the end of basically of having a politically well-functioning society, maybe a politically ideal state of affairs in a certain sense, not in an utopian sense, but in a sense of if we put these measures in place, we can tweak the state to be to our liking. For instance, it is written in the Shangzhen that we can abolish punishments with punishments, or abolish war with war, and use war and justify war for this political end. In a certain sense, what we do consciously in justifying is to evoke a concept that Popper used. It's that our mind is owning our brain. We need to determine our actions in order to justify by itself, by definition. We cannot base our judgment, our justification, our legitimization simply upon things that exist in ethical terms. If we're talking about ethics, we can try to logically prove how some consequence comes from an effect, from some source, from some origin that exists, but we cannot legitimize it in that way. This is known as the naturalistic fallacy, to say that because something exists or is, therefore we justify its presence in the world. Even so, a lot of people have tried to justify their actions in such a way. They have tried to invent kind of a philosophical and even scientific foundation for their own actions, for perhaps the future path that society is going to take. However, we see here with this fallacy and the opposite fallacy, which is to say the moralistic fallacy, to assume that because we think something ought to be, therefore it is so in the real world. There exists no connection of our actions with the truer-than-thou underlying conditions of the brain or of the material conditions. From this, there's a sort of self-legitimization that we have to construe. We have to self-justify every single thing we do if we want to think about it rationally at all. Of course, that can be debated, whether we want to think about rationally every single thing we do, or whether a lot of the things we do are in fact irrational or in connection or prompted by feelings rather than this kind of logical justification. For the other two terms, the second one, falsification, is most famously related with Popper's philosophy of science. That's because people call him falsificationist and point to him as the kind of originator of the theory that science goes works via falsification rather than verification, deduction in a sense rather than induction. Verification is a kind of religious perspective, and it has a lot to do with dogmatism in a way. as a concept that Popper confronted in the early 20s, 30s, 40s as a philosopher of science, as it was used at that time in, for example, the Vienna Circle, in the debates around the positivist school of political science, philosophy of science. In those days, the word verification was used to denote a process that we use in science in order to check whether our theories are correct. We kind of check mark them. Whether a phenomena exist in the world, we simply have to see the workings of those phenomena. We can study the workings of those effects phenomenologically, and hence we could go about the world seeing our theory justified everywhere. Popper thought this was a very biased way to go about it, because you were not paying attention to possible anomalies, possible exceptions to the rule, and even falsifications, in his sense of the word, failed tests. You had to conceptualize a test environment in which you could, or a test formulation, a logical formulation, in fact, built on the basis of your sentences that are supposed to assert your theory. And the question would be, which possible scenario, which outcome, which effect, which observation in the real world could prove this theory, these assertions, wrong. There are, of course, theories that cannot be proven wrong in this way, and this is what Popper called unfalsifiable theories, because they cannot be proven to be false. They are irrefutable, they are apodictic. They are called metaphysical theories, and usually that is with theories of the sort, there exists something somewhere invisibly, that it would be impossible to test for in this sense. And verification would be the process by which you see all the results of that being, that entity, that thing behind those workings, that underlying reality, that essence that exerts effects upon things that you can observe, and then those things prove the existence of the thing behind reality. Or as people who use this method would say, that proves it is in reality, even though it's just basically an abstract idea that may not be corroborated by the facts. Corroborated is the word Popper uses to describe a kind of verification of a theory, but via this test environment, via these circumstances that would prove the theory false. And why I would, for example, allow to call this verification as well, is because of the root of that word. Words can change their appearance, and colloquially, verification is often used simply in justification. We verify things in science. That's because we verify the facts. A journalist verifies facts, for example. He goes to search for them and often tests for them, and that's why verification is also used in this sense. So contains this notion of truth behind it, and Popper utilized the definition of truth that Tarski conceptualized, that something is true if and only if the thing. P is true if and only if P. I had that definition in a video of mine using that term verification in exactly that sense, meaning that there has to be the thing in that you're searching for, that there's this situation that would corroborate it, so that it is corroborated. That means you have to look for those facts, whether you're looking up a Wikipedia article or whether you're looking into, or whether you're told these things. There's a fundamental acceptance that Popper has with regard to our ability to know what is true. Namely that there is no criterion to exactly know something is true. We simply can name it true as a fact. Truth is what the facts are. And so he admits our fallibility. This is also a term used in philosophy to denote that we can always be proven wrong. And some people conflate the term falsifiable with a kind of irretrievable falsifiability, meaning that something is falsified, and so falsificationism is about things being endgültig falsifiziert. Now that's not Popper's theory. Because he admits our fallibility. We can be wrong about falsifications, we can be wrong about corroborations, we can be wrong about metaphysical... but the thing is we can't be wrong about metaphysical theories since they are unfalsifiable. And but scientific theories allow us to criticize them, and if criticism is possible, if it's criticizable, if a lot of things can be criticized, even non-scientific theories, if people allow themselves to be criticized. And so dogmatism is itself a kind of unscientific attitude in Popper's view. But there's also nuance in that, because dogmatism was coined in the phase of the skeptic movement of philosophy in the ancient world, and it was opposed to skepticism. And so those circumstances, they inform us on really the meaning of those two terms, skepticism and dogmatism, which maybe we'll discuss in a different video because of the complexity of the issue. We cannot prove a theory definitely to be false. We always are on the verge of tentatively knowing things. We cannot justify knowing things absolutely, simply. And therefore, the irretrievably falsifiable is not a thing. It's only theories which are falsifiable at all remain scientific theories.